And let me just introduce myself. My name is Sandra Nicholson, and I'm chair of ASME. I'm accompanied today by a panel of people who are putting together today's programme, and I will just run through that a little bit. So today's programme is sort of kicking off with a plenary talk by Dr. Kevin Eva, and we will then move on to a further talk from Professor Anna Montfort-Zumbers, and I will introduce our speakers at the time just before they speak. We then have an opportunity for you to go into the workshop of your choice, which will be facilitated. Workshop 1 is being facilitated by Dr. Katie Petton-Saffon and is on widening participation. Workshop 2 is being facilitated by Professor Fiona Patterson, and the third workshop is You're Jolly Lucky, is me, and it is on a research agenda. We have opportunity for you to ask questions, and what we would like you to do, please, to allow the session to run quite smoothly, is for you to keep your speakers, your voice on mute until instructed to turn it on for the breakout sessions. However, we wish to make this as interactive as possible with a few questions, etc. So the chat field is available for you to contribute to the conversation. And I will try and field that with the help of Jenny and Lee from ASME in the background. However, we would ask you to keep your cameras on, but to be mute during the presentations. If you're having technical problems, can I please ask you to email events@asme.org.uk, and we will try and help you. We are going to record the conference, and we hope that this is okay with you, so that the talks will be available online through the ASME website afterwards, should you wish to have a look at those, or if somebody can't attend. So I think that's mostly my housekeeping. Just to say that this is the first INRESH virtual conference. INRESH is the International Network for Researchers into Selection into Healthcare, and it was established in 2014 by the Medical Schools Council and the Association for the Study of Medical Education. We will have further events as the time goes by, and we usually attach ourselves to one of the mainline medical education conferences, but this is our first online offering, and I hope you enjoy it. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our plenary speaker, and this is Kevin Eva, who I've known for a little while. Kevin is the Associate Director and Senior Scientist at the Centre for Health Education Scholarship, and he's Professor and Director of Educational Research and Scholarship in the Department of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. However, for those of us who are in ASME, he's best known really for being our Editor-in-Chief of the journal Medical Education, which he's done since 2008. Now, Kevin has a very wide, eclectic research portfolio, but something that I learned in doing a little bit of research to present his introduction today was that he summarises this by having a core theme, which says that my diverse research interests are really answered by the question of how can we improve decision-making in the context of health professional training and practice. And I think if that drives Kevin to do research, then he's one of us. And his title today, which he's agreed to talk to, is How Could COVID-19 Push Selection Research to Where It Should Have Been All Along? And I very much look forward to hearing what he has to say. So Kevin, please take the stage.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Good morning, afternoon, or night to everyone, depending on where you happen to be joining us from. It's a pleasure for me to be here, even though obviously it would be preferable if we could talk in person, but nonetheless, glad that INRESH and the rest of you are managing to press on. This is indeed the title that I offered in speaking to Sandra about what this talk might look like. But I actually very much want to make this a COVID-free zone. The core message of the talk I'm going to convey is really that if we're thinking about how to do research in selection at this point in time, we need to be careful to not make our research about COVID. This is, I think, going to be a message that I hope is true, not just for selection research, but for all the research activities in which you might be engaged in health professional education. But obviously the focus for today will be on selection specifically. Now, I say that knowing full well that many of you will be in roles where clearly you're being impacted by COVID day to day. I'm not going to belabor all the things that have changed as a result of the current pandemic in your selection lives, because I suspect you recognize this list as well as I do. But we are rapidly having to transition to changes in grading systems, delayed admission cycles, increased use of technology. The question I want to focus on today rather than practice, however, is how has COVID changed selection research? And the answer here is a bit more complex in that what I really want to say is not only that it hasn't changed research in the way I'm going to define it, I actually hope it doesn't change research again in the way I'm going to define it. It is absolutely true that the volume of work that's being conducted has changed quite dramatically. So let me just try to walk through the logic behind the sentiment that I just expressed. As Sandra said, I have the privilege of serving as editor for medical education. These are the submissions we're receiving month by month, year over year, and quite contrary to my expectation that there might be a downtick in activity as a result of people being busy and distracted by COVID-related issues, both personal and professional. We have seen a doubling of submissions come in over the course of 2020 relative to those historical norms. In fact, in the last 9 months, we've received about 700 submissions with COVID in the title. So that's probably an underestimate, given that there are other ways of describing the pandemic. But just for sake of comparison, over the course of the past 12 years, that 9 months worth of papers coming in that claim to be about COVID is blowing everything out of the water. The most commonly used word in all of our submitted titles is feedback. And 12 years worth of feedback articles still have been fewer in number than 9 months worth of articles that have COVID in the title. For admissions and selection, you can see those numbers here. Again, those are more relevant to you, but clearly this is driving most every aspect of our lives these days, our academic focus included. What I want to argue, however, is that when we anticipate or take steps to change our research agenda because of COVID, or to better understand the process within COVID, we run the risk of ignoring the fact that we're not starting with a blank slate. We have learned many things over the past several decades about selection that I would label as principles that are applicable far and wide, whether in the pandemic or not, whether sitting in the UK or sitting in Canada, whether working with physiotherapists or working with physicians. So we're we're coming from a place that we already have solid principles on which to make decisions about how our practices need to change. And the benefit of that should continue to guide us in terms of what are the questions and the principles that we need to continue to better understand so that we can move forward long beyond this pandemic. Hopefully it will end. Hopefully it will end sooner than later. And so if we invest all of our energy in trying to understand selection in the time of COVID, we run the risk that those lessons become less relevant or less useful to us over the long term. So again, to put a bit more clarity around that general argument, there are many principles that I could point to as representative of what we have learned through all the excellent work that's been done in admissions and selection. These are some that I would put forward because I think they are fairly universal, and because I believe they largely cover the waterfront. Again, not with any implication that they are comprehensive, but I think at this point in time, given the way the evidence is accumulated, it would be fairly hard to dispute some of these claims. I put them here to say that these are general principles that are quite relevant across different contexts, and that's the type of knowledge that I would say we need to continue prioritizing within health professional education, because we do work in such a diverse array of situations. Take COVID away. The fact that again, you work in medicine in a particular university in the UK means that for your research to be impactful and relevant elsewhere, it needs to recognize that me working in occupational therapy in Vancouver in Canada would still like to learn from your efforts rather than just gaining the knowledge that you've been successful or not in whatever it is that you've been doing. So the key questions that I particularly want to address are, how did we manage to generate such understanding? And how can we continue to produce knowledge that will be relevant to the next unpredictable disruption? And COVID will go away at some point, but there's going to be something else on the horizon, and we again don't want to find ourselves just feeling like we need to start from scratch. My answer to this question, or these questions of how do we conduct research that gives us broadly relevant information at the level of principles rather than local details, is that I think it's critically important that we draw a distinction between the platforms on which we do research and the phenomena about which we do research. And in my perspective, the current pandemic is nothing more than a platform. It's a context that will have an influence on our data, will have an influence on our practice, but it's not the phenomenon that we really want to better understand. Right? What we want to understand is what drives people's performance measurements. How can we get better data to account for the variety of circumstances that might impact upon their capacity to perform in a variety of the domains that we care about in our selection practices. The distinction that often comes up in making such an argument is between evaluation, collecting data that is highly relevant to evaluate what we're doing, and research as something that creates more general knowledge. And I don't draw the distinction to say that one is more important than another. I truly do believe that that evaluation work is critical and an important form of scholarship for our fields. But this is INRASH, so I'm going to be a bit more provocative in terms of saying, if we are thinking of ourselves as researchers, we need to put ourselves in a very different position than we work when we're operating as evaluators, worrying about how to improve practice in our local context. As researchers, we have to prioritize generalization over quality assurance. I can tell you that the modal reason that papers don't even get sent for review at medical education, and the same has been true for many years, is that the articles submitted don't make a compelling reason or a compelling argument as to why the data that have been collected are relevant beyond the institution where they were collected. Another way of saying that in Cook, Bordage, and Schmidt's terms is that we need to prioritize questions and data collection that enable clarification of why things are occurring rather than description of what actually occurred. And just to put a finer point on it, that's actually the terminology that Regehr used in putting forward an argument as to what differentiates research from evaluation, which is that we should be pursuing the imperative of understanding, asking questions that amount to why did this occur, or why might that occur, as opposed to the imperative of proof, which is the demonstration that something did actually occur. And again, that's all fairly abstract, I appreciate, but let me try to make this a little bit more concrete by offering a few examples from the work that I've been involved with. Again, I'm going to focus on the multiple mini interview process that many of you will be familiar with, not because it's particularly special in this regard, but because I can speak to that literature a bit more facilely than some others. It is absolutely true that there have been a lot of descriptive questions that we had to ask about that process, and particularly early on. Hopefully the fact that you see my name here on a couple of occasions serves as an indication that, again, I don't mean to be belittling descriptive work. It is important, but all these questions, were we able to achieve a reasonable degree of reliability? Were ratings that we collected associated with important outcomes? Did we disadvantage particular demographic groups in the data that we were collecting? Those are all questions that are very much descriptive in nature and come along with little reassurance that just because we had success, that we could tell others how they might replicate that success. I think the best way to drive that point home is to draw your attention to this piece of art that I suspect many of you have seen, which really was an argument that art represents reality. It isn't reality in and of itself. This isn't a pipe. It's a very good representation of one, but it nonetheless is not literally a pipe. And if we sort of use that metaphorically to think about the work that we're doing in admissions, I would argue that, in fact, we make a mistake to talk about the MMI. There is no such thing as the MMI, because the way we implement it will be different than the way you implement it. And if you look across the literature, you'll see there's tremendous variability in implementation, despite the fact that people are using the same terminology. We've quite freely talked about the MMI in a way that sounds nonsensical when you compare it to the multiple choice question exam. we know in that latter domain, there are many different ways in which you can populate that type of assessment. And the same issue applies to multiple mini interviews. The stations you put in will have an influence on what you're potentially measuring, and the way in which you set up the process will influence the quality of the data that you receive. So again, the onus therefore becomes one of, how do I collect data within the context or based on the platform of my MMI that will help clarify for other people why we had the success or the lack thereof that we've observed. And that's why I think it's been more impactful to ask clarifying questions about that process. Does it matter who provides the ratings? How many observations are required to achieve a particular degree of reliability? Is the amount of time impactful? And how does the alteration of our process influence the subgroups that we're biasing against or supporting, rather than asking more descriptive questions I alluded to earlier of, are some subgroups disadvantaged? And these are questions that other people can use to make decisions about how they're going to create their MMI, rather than just trusting that because someone else has had success, that they necessarily will as well. Let me just give you a bit more detail on only one example that I hope reflects that point a little bit further. In that one of the questions that we were very interested in from an early stage is it sampling, getting repeated observations of candidates' performance that's yielding the benefit that we thought we were observing? Or is it standardization, the fact that we're asking the same questions of all of our candidates for the most part? Again, both of these issues were put forward in the early writings about multiple mini interviews as a way of saying this was some of the logic that we followed to design the process. But we really didn't have any data early on that helped us make an empirical claim as to which was more important, if either was. And so we, again, instead of using whatever data we happen to have available to us, we had to deliberately design a study to get the data that would help us answer this more clarifying question. And so in a 12-station MMI, we actually had 4 stations that we repeated 3 different times in 3 different ways. First of all, we told 4 of our interviewers simply that we're trying in this MMI to get a better understanding of the candidate's professional demeanor. Talk about whatever you need to talk about for the next 8 minutes to get whatever impression you can form about how strong that individual's professional demeanor happens to be. The 2 other sets of stations were more structured, and they were more like typical MMI stations. But in one form, we deliberately designed particular situations that we asked candidates to imagine themselves being in, and asked the interviewer to conduct a conversation with them about that particular situation and the activities that they thought might be appropriate, or the behaviors that they thought should be avoided. In the behavioral interviewing version of things, again, we asked parallel questions, but instead of telling them about a particular situation, what we did was the more typical behavioral interviewing strategy, where we said, tell us about a time when you have experienced a situation like this, and that became the focus of the conversation. So again, here we had a bit more control than we normally have, in that we had 4 stations that were simply rewritten to try to meet different formats. And what we found that I think is important to this more general principle that I'm trying to draw your attention to is that in the two conditions where the questions were highly standardized, we definitely got the improvement that we had seen in other studies relative to what we had seen in our more traditional interviews. But we got the vast majority of that improvement even in the free-form version of the questions. When we didn't tell the interviewers or the candidates what we wanted them to talk about in detail, we just asked them to carry on a conversation that they thought would be informative. So again, there's a bit of a bump that seems to come from standardization, at least in this study. But if I had to advise somebody on whether it's more important to invest the energy in setting up a process that samples performance as much as possible versus setting up a process where we put a lot of energy into making sure that we're asking very consistent questions, I think you're going to get more bang from your buck by worrying about sampling as a priority. Again, though, this is really just one example. The core message that I'm hoping to prompt some discussion on this morning is that as researchers, we need to embrace our inner child and just continually play that game of asking why to every piece of information or every piece of evidence that we're presented. Why does this occur? Once that question is answered, again, why? What is it that's prompting or setting the situational factors that enable such observations to occur? And again, just by way of example, I started this talk with a list of many of the things that have changed as a result of COVID impacting upon our practices. I would argue that if we're to treat COVID as a platform, we now have this great opportunity to answer some questions that would have been much more difficult to answer if we were still living in pre-pandemic times. Right? Those things have changed, and they've created a natural experiment where we can compare what's happening now to what happened previously in ways that do hopefully give us more general information, but in ways that would have been difficult to implement as a research study because a lot of these questions require a fundamental change to our admissions process. And that becomes a very political discussion, much more than it is a scientific discussion, at least quite often. Right. So again, I've just sort of written example questions that parallel all those practical changes that I identified. Are prerequisites important? If we can't get access to the prerequisites we normally do, has it changed anything? Are predicted grades as predictive as the grades that people have actually been able to attain in previous circumstances? How does the process through which one gained entry influence their professional identity as they're trying to grow into becoming a physician or a physiotherapist or something else? Again, these are not a comprehensive list of questions. They're just a reflection on how we might move from the focus on the local to using this platform we now unfortunately have of COVID to better understand something that will last beyond the current pandemic. Because I think that the best that we can offer as researchers is not the right answer. Right? Often we get into research because we feel like we need to provide the right answer to an important question in our field. Education generally and selection particularly they're complex domains. They're wicked problems, and that if you try to solve one problem, a different problem is going to creep up. And so there isn't ever going to be a single right solution. and hopefully it's empowering as a result for you to think about your research efforts as being nothing more than trying to offer critically important and evidence-informed discussions that will influence the culture of practice, enhance the adaptability of our protocols, rather than simply confirming or refuting that they've been effective. Said a different way, with apologies to John Kennedy for bastardizing his famous speech. Ask not what there is to learn about COVID-related selection, but ask what COVID-related adjustments can help you to learn about selection more generally. Again, we're all living in frustrating times for various reasons right now, but this is going to pass, and we want to make sure that we're not investing all of our energy into data collection or questions that are going to be much less relevant, hopefully in the near future. So I will end there and alert Sandra to the fact that I have not been looking at the chat that's been coming in at all. So if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to address them.
Thank you, Kevin, for a very thought-provoking speech, and I'm sure the people that you have borrowed from will forgive you. Yes, indeed. I have been looking at the chat, and I can see several questions and comments coming in. Thank you very much for encouraging us to think about the bigger picture. And we have got a couple of minutes for questions, which I won't gobble up, so I will let people actually ask them or make them. So Paul Tiffin, are you directing us to this site to look at, or would you like to make a comment verbally about that?
Well, I don't want to take up much airtime, Sandra. By the way, just checking out. Am I on off mute? Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, great. Sorry, I'm never quite sure. No, it was just directed. It was just something Chris McManus and ourselves put together because we'd already managed and sorted out some UK Med data as part of another project, which we realized we could use to look at attained, the old question about attained versus predicted grades. And so we hurried that out onto the preprint site, medRxiv, because in STEM sciences, so people involved in STEM will know that arXiv is a big repository of preprint, pre-review stuff to get out quickly. But it's only starting to be used more widely in applied health sciences. So we rushed it out there, but it's currently, as far as I'm aware, it's under review at the moment with BMJ Open. But unsurprisingly, we showed that predicted grades are poorer outcomes, poorer predictors of outcome, academic outcome than actual grades. I was trying to persuade Chris to do some fiddling around to look at effects of independent versus or selective versus non-selective schooling as well. But we ran into some sort of technical issues to do with the fact that people in independent schools were sort of maxing out on the A stars, 3 A stars in sort of English advanced level terms. Therefore, it artifactually produced some issues which were hard to work around. But I think there has been a bit of work elsewhere on that very recently, which suggests, unsurprisingly, that those people from less well-performing schools and state schools are more likely to have grades under predicted, if you see what I mean, unsurprisingly. So anyway, so that's, if people are interested, that paper's out there in preprint version on the web address I gave.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I think a lot of us would like to have a look at that, and so thank you for the link. If I could, I'm going to ask something a little bit more general. So talking about evaluation versus research and the importance of generalization and generalizability, and also thinking about theory, brings back the old chestnut of quantitative versus qualitative research. I use the term versus. I don't particularly like that because I think often they're very much complementary and they have so much more in common than one would think. Yeah. So is this, can you defend that, do you think?
I do think so. We'll see if you agree. And I agree completely, though, that the versus is the wrong word. I think the field has matured and professionalized to the point that we now recognize that qualitative studies and quantitative studies have different things to offer, and really it's the alignment between the questions that we're asking and the data we're collecting that's critical, not prioritizing one or the other. But I'm glad you raised this, because I want to be very careful to draw people's attention to the fact that I use the word generalization, not generalizability. I don't mean to use that word in the quantitative sense that, as we often do in the biomedical world, that we evaluate the quality of our work based on the extent to which a pattern of data seen in one place will necessarily replicate in another place. It is very likely to be true that, again, just by virtue of the fact that we're all designing and running MMIs that fit our context, that the data that we get out of those contexts may not be perfectly replicated from one to the next. What I was arguing in saying generalization is important is that the issues we're trying to address and the lessons we're trying to learn from that should be more generally relevant, that they should be adaptable to other circumstances, rather than necessarily assuming or trusting that the data themselves are generalizable. So it's more the sense of, are the questions that we're asking, the data we're collecting, do they yield relevant knowledge in a variety of places, rather than is it that the data will be the same?
I mean, I'm sure there are people that would like to discuss that further, but but because of time we can't. But I think your elaboration, if you like, is really helpful to think about what you've just said. It isn't just about generalization. It is, or generalizability, and the differences between those two items. But I thought I'd get a punt in there for qualitative researchers.
No, absolutely. I'm on board. And if I could just speak to Paul's paper a little bit, again, just very excited to see that work like that is being done, because there's a lot of lore and a lot of mythology built up around grade point average, and it's very easy to come up with arguments around why it isn't trustworthy. Different people take different classes, and some of them might be harder than others. Different institutions might have greater rates of grade inflation than others. All kinds of reasons to distrust GPA. But still, as a general rule, academic success is generally predictive of academic success. And so rather than just trusting our intuitions around whether we should prioritize science grades or prioritize the most recent grades, or give people an opportunity to drop their worst year, there are all kinds of different strategies people have used to try to make those measures more robust. Generally, it hasn't mattered as much as we tend to intuit. And so to see there's some empirical work being done on this unexpected issue that's arisen in the UK that might shine some light on that issue further is great.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Kevin. I know there is a couple more questions, but I'm afraid we do need to move on. But thank you very much for your inspiring discussion. And I'm hoping that some of those themes will be carried through into the workshops. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Anna Montford-Zimbars, who comes from Exeter University. And she is the academic co-founder and co-director of the Centre for Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. And she directs jointly with her practice colleague, the head of widening participation there too. I always think selection and research and selection and widening participation go hand in hand. Anna is also the Professor of Social Mobility at the Graduate School of Education. And she is going to talk today about the unequal experiences during crisis schooling. and early insights from students, parents, teachers, and university outreach staff. So Anna, please, thank you. I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Absolutely delighted to be here. I see myself as very much a part-time academic, being primarily the mother of twins. I come originally from Hamburg, so I'm really delighted to see so many people from Hamburg here. So moin, really pleased to be here. Yeah, if there are any jobs going post-Brexit, please give me a job. After that sort of pitch, the reason I'm here is because I have conducted a bit of rapid response research on the impact of the school closure. I should say I was really intrigued by what Kevin said, because a lot of my other work has been on contextual admissions. And I see the spirit in which I conducted this rapid response research was really, it wasn't gold standard peer-reviewed research. That wasn't the aim. I'm one of many projects having conducted rapid response research, but I think we were one of the first. So we were out there collecting data 2 days after the schools closed to gauge what the impact, what people expected the impact to be at that point and what it actually was. So it's not like a gold standard representative national sample, but it was rapid and it was immediate when the schools closed. I'm also doing work with parents of home educated before the school closure, and I've done some work especially children with special educational needs, or particularly affected by the school closure. But so the motivation was really give rapid response to policymakers to make changes. So the research has been submitted to several Parliament inquiries. We made 3 submissions from this research. And I think it has rapidly informed policy in the sense that I was also asked to be on radio and asked whether they should close pubs or schools. And I said pubs, so I take single-handedly credit for that. Of course I don't, but I mean, it was that type of research that wasn't intended to be in a top-tier journal, but just get a feel for the land as it was happening and unfolding. And I think the first headline finding, I think that's really important not to lose sight of, was we went out there with concerns about grades and progression. A lot of our questions in the surveys, the survey was targeted at parents, teachers, outreach staff, and students. And we asked about concerns about their progression and attainment, but not to lose sight of the fundamentals in this pandemic. The responses we got, especially from parents, teachers, and outreach staff, was, well, this throws us back to basics, to safety. Some children are better off in schools than at home. It's a minority, but they were concerned. It throws us back to well-being, mental health, which needs to be in place for students to be able to thrive and even think about attainment progression. And for some people, it throws us back to basics like food and nutrition and access not being as wide during the pandemic. In terms of inequality, already at the beginning, quite stark concerns there about the inequalities. And I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, or you don't even have to be a social scientist to have predicted some of these issues. And we were going out there specifically, I think, to sort of say this is actually happening, what we predict, which is that there will be inequality and it will be heightened, that homeschooling, I'm very careful to call it crisis schooling, because I am doing this research with those who electively home educate, and they said what we've seen during this pandemic is not home education. Home education is a sort of considered process of how you want to educate your child outside the school system. This isn't that sort of process. It's crisis schooling, it's remote schooling, and as we know now, there has been great variation in how that has panned out. I mean, in Exeter's got quite a sort of divided school system where with private schools who've often maintained a high level of engagement at 9 to 4 p.m. sort of engagement with children remotely, and some of the other schools that are less well funded, it has been more sort of crisis schooling and dumping some things online, and hoping that parents will read it and work with the children, and then comments coming back from teachers now also going to post the school closure. What we know is that some children have not had any support at home during that time, that they've literally just lost all that time. So we are, during the school closure, placing a lot of emphasis on parents and their ability to support children. The teachers were not fully prepared to do this, although as a silver lining, we did find that a lot of teachers found that the skills they've learned during the lockdown, during the school closure, have been really helpful and will help them in the future. But it's not possible to do that sort of level of differentiation that you would see in a face-to-face teaching session. Here are some numbers. I mean, they're not based on a huge sample, but just to give you an indication of something we would have expected, that being schooled in this crisis mode means you do need access to a quiet place to study, and you need access to IT, and that there are differences when you look at children who are on free school meals as a measure of disadvantage compared to those who are not, where there's lower access to those private places to study and also to technology. Teachers said it would have a negative impact on student well-being, and overall we did have the Edinburgh Warwick scale for mental health in our survey, and levels were lower than they would be normally in a population survey, and this was true for all groups. It was particularly true for young people who were less highly attaining and had no sort of plans for the future. If students who had specific plans to go to university, they reported higher levels of well-being. I thought that was quite interesting. I also thought, I mean, these were qualitative comments. We got a few, so I am probably guilty of cherry picking a bit here, but it's something that I thought might be interesting to explore further in the future. That better off students from our material that we could see, they seem to miss the teachers more, and the disadvantaged students miss the physical space of school. So I thought there might be something in there, and it might be something that maybe you can think about in university admissions and medical school admissions, about the role of the teacher and how reliant different students are on that experience. Also wanted to highlight, just again, because of the other work I was doing on those who electively home educate. So this is a number of potentially up to 20,000 children who've missed out completely on GCSEs and A-levels. And this is a group that in the UK is not generally part of policy discussions. I know in America, this group is part of discussions, and I know in Germany, you aren't allowed to home educate, so it wouldn't be an issue. But what conclusion I come to is that this is an opportunity to radically rethink what we're doing, because this is a group that has been missed out in the UK for a long time. It's been heightened by the pandemic and by the school policy during that time. But it is a group that's not normally on the radar of anyone. So thinking of contextual admissions, I think it's just sort of thinking about and thinking how radical can we be now, and thinking of new groups that might have been excluded in the past. Just to give you a couple more stats from other research, which has been more representative and larger scale, but it's broadly, I mean, it's finding same patterns in terms of that poorer children, they've had fewer daily educational activities than better off children, and that mental health is worsening, but also the role of tutors is very interesting, because middle class families, and especially in places like London, anecdotally, they've been able to access a lot of tutors and sort of patch up the support that schools haven't been able to offer during the pandemic, and help their children progress. We've got a few references here, got some references to my contextual admissions work here as well. I'm actually currently doing a bit of work on medical schools contextual admissions, which is hopefully forthcoming. But I think what I'm really interested in is sort of, I mean, there are big issues that are outside just medical school admissions and about society, about which jobs are valued, the head and the hand and the heart, and how do we redistribute wealth in society, or might we redistribute wealth and rewards in society as a result of the pandemic, and of thinking about which jobs we really need and want. But more directly relevant to your practice, hopefully, is the idea of what interventions can we put in place to help disadvantaged children catch up, but also what can you maybe put in place in your admissions thinking and processes to be mindful of this differential experience and not to miss out on potential that has maybe not materialized fully. And I really like that idea. I've nicked this from Edinburgh. They've had this sort of for many years, this idea in contextualized admissions about minimum preparedness, and sort of saying, if you haven't got that as a minimum, we think it would be sort of unethical to admit you to our programs because you're unlikely or very unlikely to succeed. but that threshold is probably significantly lower than the standard threshold that you might implement in your program to enable selection, because you've got so many applicants who are highly qualified. And so, I mean, I think that's the sort of rethink I would like to see. I don't know what the answer is, but just something more fundamental about why are we selecting, what are we selecting for, and what, like, I mean, the MMI and all these tools, they're obviously, and I'm not a medical educator and I'm not involved in these processes, so I can be sort of maybe too flippant about it, but saying these are sort of tools at a disposal to achieve an overall aim. And I think I'm just saying, let's rethink the overall aim of what we are trying to achieve here, and what is the minimum ability and potential people need to thrive and succeed. I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful, Anna. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we all really enjoyed that. And it was great to see the way you sort of jumped in there at the beginning and got going straight away. It's a bit like the recovery trial over the, you know, the treatment of COVID in the UK. You know, people just got there and started sorting it out. I mean, tying it in with the things that Kevin was talking about as well, what are we going to do now? These things have happened as a result of COVID. There's been these terribly unequal experiences. So what are we going to do to change things, do you think, to be able to make the system better? I mean, you talked about things like the home educated students, which clearly missed out because of the whole exam thing and not being able to have the centre assess grades from them. But what have you learned from it, and what do you think we should be working on?
Well, I hope people are going to put some responses in the chat here, because this is a question for everyone. I might not actually be the best person to respond, but I mean, we are in the middle of a big natural experiment, in the sense that I know at Exeter we've got 55 more medical students than we would have normally had because of the changes to how admissions was undertaken. And I believe at Queen Mary that the numbers in a similar sort of region. So it is about us researchers or working in the field. There's an opportunity to create new evidence, but new thinking of sort of tracking these students who are successful. I mean, that's sort of a very sort of applied meso micro level answer, but I hope that some people have a more meta answer what we are going to do, but it does need a rethink. And I personally don't think post-qualification admissions is the simple answer to everything, and because that seems to be where the policy debate is at the moment. And I also wonder whether international colleagues can help us here with what they think the big learning points are outside our specific issues in the UK.
So has anybody got a question? No need to put your hand up, just jump in and ask a question if anyone's got one. Someone trying to speak and needs to unmute? Well, let's see, what have we got in the chat? I'm so short-sighted that, yeah, well, why doesn't, David Harrison, why don't you explain about Kath's work and what you did in response to COVID?
Yeah, really the paper that I've put there is kind of a companion to the paper that Paul Tiffin sort of put up. So once the lockdown was announced, we actually surveyed our participants in the study. So we got around 3,000 responses, if I remember correctly, and really sort of gathering the views of the applicants themselves on calculated grades, what medical schools should be doing, but also something about their experience in lockdown education. And particularly there was that difference between the independent schools were very well prepared and set up for doing online teaching, whereas state schools sort of lagged behind. And there was a lot of concern about what impact that was going to have. So I don't know, yeah, as you say, I really don't know how to address that. And I don't think that post-qualification sort of applications are really the way to solve it.
they could solve other things, I suppose, couldn't they? In terms of the issue now. I mean, Kevin may not know, but in the UK we've got 10% additional medical students than were anticipated 2 weeks before the beginning of term. So the sort of logistics of trying to do that in socially distanced ways is just putting amazing pressures on people.
Absolutely, and it was interesting that we found the applicants themselves were aware of that potential for increased pressure. So they had their own thoughts about whether they should be deferring and what impact that would have on future years as well. You know, it's the COVID situation isn't just going to impact this year's applicants.
Yeah, absolutely, which is why we're pushing the Department of Health and DfE to say they will fund additional places next year for those who've deferred, because it's just not fair to the applicants who are coming up and would normally, not have extra competition for places going forward. So I hope we've more or less won that argument, but until you actually see the money, you don't know, do you? So have we got any other questions for Anna? No? Okay. Well, look, Anna, thank you very much indeed. It was just great to have someone come from a slightly different discipline and be able to sort of focus our minds on some of the other things and just see what's going on and how we're going to be able to support these kids who really did suffer so badly throughout this whole thing. So I think the pressures are going to be very significant in all sorts of anticipated areas. So it was brilliant. So, and I can see some thanks to you in the chat as well. So we will collect those in and pass them on to you afterwards, Anna. But good luck collecting your twins. So I'm glad we managed to finish in time to allow you to pick them up. So thank you very much. So the next bit for those of the rest of us, we're going to move on into our breakout groups now. So I'm going to leave it to Lee to wave her magic wand and transport us into 3 different breakout rooms. So Lee, over to you.
Hi everyone, nice to see so many familiar faces. So I hope you enjoyed your discussion groups. Had some really interesting insights from our group, and I'm sure we have across other groups. So we've got a very short amount of time to hear back from each of those groups because we want to capture that learning. As you know, we're recording this session and we'll make sure that we give you all the materials that are discussed after today. So we're going to have 5 minutes each for each of the groups to feedback. We've got designated presenters. So if we can, let's hear from workshop 1, please, on widening participation.
Yeah, sure. Let me just share my screen because I've just taken some notes very quickly during that discussion. Can everyone see this? I'm very conscious that there's more noted down than perhaps I expected, so I appreciate you can't necessarily read this. Maybe I can share it afterwards, but if nothing else, it will help to guide me. I guess firstly, just to say thank you for those that participated in our group. It was a really interesting discussion and really helpful to hear a range of different perspectives on widening participation. In terms of what we were looking to cover, I think really we wanted a discussion around the impact of the pandemic on widening participation and any examples that might be shared in terms of good practice and solutions to some of the problems that were encountered. So we had a few questions here that were, I suppose, initial prompts to introduce that discussion. I must say, I think it was a shame in a way that we ran out of time because I think the conversation was in full flow and we'd covered quite a lot in terms of the impact of the pandemic and perhaps hadn't got quite so far in terms of some of the longer term implications and some of the solutions that might come from that as well. So hopefully that conversation can continue in some form and that people are able to kind of, get in touch and share ideas as things progress. In terms of just to pick out a few of the points that we did touch on that were, I think, particularly interesting. So starting with the impact of the pandemic, I think it was actually quite nice to hear that In terms of the selection side of the conversation, I think there was quite a few positives to take from some of the changes that were made as a result of the current context. So I thought that was interesting. There was examples shared around kind of lower cost of travel and interview clothes and things like that for applicants, as well as applicants finding the interview experience less stressful when they're doing it remotely, and greater uptake for virtual open days and virtual Q&As and things like that. They're actually, I suppose, beneficial for the schools to be able to offer that to a broader range of people than they might typically. So I think one of the things kind of looking longer term is actually leveraging some of those positives. And I know there were certainly suggestions around that last example of potentially offering kind of online virtual open days alongside of traditional open days in the future and things like that. So I think it's actually quite interesting that that the context kind of forces your hand to make certain changes, and then although that can cause some disruption, there's also certain positives to take that can be then useful to adopt longer term. Some of the concerns, I guess, that came on the selection side were around applicants not necessarily able to seek the same kind of career advice that they might be able to under more normal circumstances. And I know Rachel from MSc shared that MSc have got quite a few queries from people that they maybe wouldn't have in previous cohorts because people don't quite know who to turn to. And I think the other things for applicants were the missed opportunities. So things like missed opportunities for work experience, and also when it came to the outreach side, missed opportunities to meet student ambassadors and maybe kind of have their eyes open to that perspective from people that are probably typically quite good at kind of selling the experience to prospective students. In terms of the learning side, which I guess is the other part of the conversation, I think there was quite a lot to talk about. I think there was definitely some concerns raised in terms of students' access to technology and other factors that, for WP students in particular, potentially disproportionately affected by other issues in terms of home environment and, with having a lot of other things going on during lockdown, potentially struggling to engage with their education in the way that they'd like to, as well as, certain learning opportunities not being possible, for example, simulation and things like that. Looking at some of the long-term implications that were discussed, I think I've already alluded to this a little bit, but I think there's some discussion around, what reverts to normal, and what actually I guess leads to longer term change or encourages people to adopt slightly different approaches. I think there was some concerns raised about the impact on student well-being and mental health, and I think that's something that could be a much longer term implication. So unfortunately, we didn't quite get to solutions on that, which is a shame, and clearly not something that's necessarily easy to solve, but clearly something that will be important to schools moving forward and to students moving forward as well. I don't know if anyone from my group has anything to add to that, but that's kind of an overview of where we got to in that conversation, I think.
Great, thank you, Sam. Well done, because I know you've had a busy 25 minutes. And it's really nice to have it recorded. We'll all have the opportunity to read through all of that reflectively. So thank you. Well done. No pressure. You did brilliantly.
Brilliantly. Well done. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, well done. So let's hear them from the second workshop on digital selection. Emma Louise, I think.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, grand. Okay, so yes, I was on the workshop for digital selection rather, and the questions that we focused on were what changes have occurred and how we've had to adapt. So I think that's definitely one thing that you'll see from what we've experienced in our chat was the fact that we all were forced into this, right? So we were all, depending on where you were at in your recruitment process and when your lockdown started, depending on what country you were in, we were looking at how you had to adapt at the time of COVID. And then we explored a little bit around some of those benefits and disadvantages. So there we go. I don't think I did as well as Sam, but we'll do our best here. I'll just make that a little bit
Just pop that
bigger.
on full screen, Emma-Louise.
There we go. Is that a little bit better? All right. So in terms of the impact and how people had to adapt moving their selection online, so some had to kind of give up on interviews altogether, focusing more on verified self-assessments and situational judgment tests, for instance. Others had to work to try and move some form of interview online, and across the different experiences that were shared, which were all really insightful, was that some had to use kind of a one interview panel. Others were able to use breakout rooms just like we did for our workshop, and either move applicants around or move assessors around. And I think seeing all of the different experiences there just goes to show how everyone just had to kind of go to that whiteboard and figure out how they were going to do this. And everyone took a slightly different approach depending on the admin hours and the IT they had available. So just discussing really quickly some of those benefits and disadvantages, and I will just put out there, obviously this is all some anecdotal evidence here, but the one comment was that it was easier to access assessors. So I know some of our Australian colleagues on the call, especially with rural assessors out there, they were able to contribute in the online forum, whereas they wouldn't have been able to commute to a face-to-face assessment. People have had some initial positive reactions from both applicants and assessors. And one thing I found really interesting in that conversation as well was noticed better objective scoring or standardization of scoring. Apologies, I can't remember who said this in the chat, but there were some concerns from assessors that they wouldn't be able to get the vibe, if you will, from a good candidate by not having that interaction face-to-face. And I think for some, they actually found that it was much easier to score objectively against descriptors. It was acknowledged, however, that there are more administration hours required and technical support hours required for digital selection procedures. However, you do save money on venue hire and catering. There were comments around safeguarding as well, given that you are going to be one-to-one, and especially for those in the UK, candidates are likely under the age of 18. As well, we did have one say that their technology did crash. So obviously, the digital selection has almost been our backup plan for a lot of us who would usually go into a face-to-face setting. But it just goes to show you that you kind of need to think of a plan C as well if something does go and crash on you on the day. And it just recognizes the IT required, especially if you were to go large scale. And then there were comments around that interactive element, and I think that also relates to some of the conversation you were having in the workshop, in workshop 1, around acknowledging that recruitment is a two-way process. And so do applicants get to see enough of the university that they're wishing to attend, as well as the assessors the other way around. So just in terms of initial experiences, a lot were saying that they would be likely to continue with some form of online methodology, whether it was fully online or others keen to return to a face-to-face, more structured MMI setting. However, perhaps introducing a screening tool, whether that be an asynchronous interview or some form of situational judgment test or written test before that. I think we covered everything, but I just want to make that clear to everyone who wasn't in our workshop, that these were some of the issues that we were kind of picking up on in terms of digital selection, and obviously things that we weren't able to discuss with hard-earned evidence in terms of the accuracy and making sure that we don't assume that we can just pull our existing interview material online and that it will be valid and reliable. And just also recognizing that applicants may be less deterred to apply by travel costs. However, you still do need that quiet space and access to technology and hardware to be able to complete that online process. I think that's everything, Fiona. I'll pass
That's brilliant, Emma Louise. You did equally well as Sam. Well done, because that's no easy ask. Having facilitated that group, I think that's a really good reflection of what we discussed. And you know, just the only thing I would add is how much I enjoyed having such an international audience, because the learning between us was just fabulous. And we're really keen to continue the conversation, but I'll say something more about that once we've heard from our final workshop, which is on the research horizons and the research agenda going forward. So over to you, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Perfect. Okay, so these are the questions that in our workshop we wanted to address. So really just considering what the future research priorities are going forward. So we did touch on all of these points through the discussion. So specifically looking at changes in focus, you know, the comparison between face-to-face and remote, the longitudinal impact, and also the fairness issues. So we were a bit of a combination of the two previous workshops, but I do think we can definitely offer a few additional insights as we go through. So again, like Simon and Louise, I've also tried to scrabble through as there's some really great conversations going on. So thank you for everyone for participating in the workshop. So just to bring out some of the high level detail, I did try and take a bit more detail as we go through. So if anyone has got any additional points to add, please do let us know, and I'm happy to add those in. So looking at the impact of the pandemic on research, so there was a fantastic quote to start us off, which was, "Everything's changed, but nothing's changed." So really pushing us to start thinking about and addressing the blind spots within both selection and widening participation. Also really mindful of the changes to the vocation. So obviously, as we know, within healthcare, there have been quite big differences. The people working within these roles are more at risk. So going to work and with the risk of COVID, both to themselves and their lives in as well as the patients as well. And, you know, does this change any of our underlying values that we are measuring when we're looking at selection, and also questioning current constructs, and is this what we need to look at instead? We also flagged, you know, the unintentional consequences. You know, what if we're looking at, you know, GCSE grades instead of A levels or predicted grades, etc. What are the impact of, you know, late bloomers, for example, or also the variation between the support that students are given. So the differences between private and state schools, and again, really flagging that we won't really see this impact for quite a few years. And also, if this was the point where it does put a spotlight on the cognitive tests and what that does for perceptions as well. So moving on, so does the selection process favour certain kinds of healthcare professions? So we were kind of talking about, yeah, the stuff that they look at as well, apart from you know, specific cognitive tests, etc. We've got the extracurricular activities. So if this can't happen, then what can you look at? And also flagging that is also different to widening participation students anyway. You know, some exams happened, some didn't. How will this impact what we look at in next year and in future years as well? And then in specific to looking at that difference between healthcare professions, of course, having the international group within us was fantastic to get the different perspectives. So it was flagged that obviously the UK is very undergraduate based, and therefore we do commonly, the students would lack more work experience, and there is a shift worldwide to hopefully create that more generalist rather than specific specialties going forward, and what kind of impact that would be if people can't have this work experience, and to get that you know, experience of what it's like to be within those roles. Another great quote is that no one actually knows the answer to these currently. These are things that you have to look at in the future. Will the dropouts be higher? And what will the impact be on the students? And also a lot of questions these questions that we're actually looking at were obviously issues and priorities before the pandemic. And that was one thing that was really brought to our attention, that they're probably the same things that we're looking at. Why is this different? And the difference is that COVID has given us an issue to destabilise and give us an opportunity to readdress some of these issues. So the two first points were very interesting, and therefore we did kind of get cut short on the future research agenda, so I'm sure there were some additional points that we could have gone into, but just looking a little bit forward, I'm just moving my face away from it. So looking at, of course, are we getting different people applying, and what kind of impact does this have on the students? Can we get a language into comparative studies? So just building on Kevin's speak about the MMI, how can we make it, pardon me, so you can actually compare these tests? And there was also the idea about analysing the logic of admissions, both implicit and explicit. And it was also flagged that in the Netherlands, they are conducting a nationwide study about how selection may be biased towards certain groups. So we're very excited to see how that turns out as well. And I'll hand back over to you, Fiona.
That's brilliant, Jordan. Last but not least, equally stunning in terms of your summary. And actually, there's some really fabulous ideas emerging there, and some of the issues. You know, again, I just don't think some of those would emerge unless we had an international audience with everyone contributing the way that have. So yeah, it's been a quick whirlwind, 3 important topics. So I hope people have found that of interest, and there's plenty for us all to reflect on. Before I hand back to Katie to close the session in the last 5 minutes, I just want to say thank you for everybody's participation in the workshop. I hope you enjoyed that. It was really nice to see how Kevin and Anna's talk has just helped sort of provoke some of the discussions, and I'm sure got our thinking going. Yeah, I think it's been a really fabulous session. And the last thing I want to say is, and it came up in our group, if we could find some way over the coming weeks and months to share more of these discussions. I think, for example, Katie, for the Medical Schools Council Selection Alliance in the UK, I know you have orchestrated, everybody's saying how useful that network was, and our reflections were actually if we could replicate something similar at an international level, just what huge learning we would have, you know, from all people's experiences that have been shared today. So on that note, I shall hand over to you, Katie, to finish the session.
Well, that's a really nice way to sort of round it off and think about going global, because I was looking back, for those of you who haven't been to all the INRESH meetings that we've had, we first set it up in 2014, and the idea was to exchange ideas and to generate new thinking, but most importantly to create new constructive working relationships across the globe. And certainly in my group, we found there was one way that we could link up with the team in Germany to do something. And I'm sure the other groups, it was exactly the same. So I think Fiona's right. I think we've got to keep this going. It's been really important for us. In a way, one of the benefits of COVID has meant that it has been easier for us all to be able to find time. We're not commuting, we're not doing this and that. Some of you have got up terribly early in the morning. Some of you have not yet gone to bed when you really should have been. It's way past your bedtimes. I'm afraid we rather selfishly left it to sort of end of a Friday afternoon in the UK. But, you know, we're still here. Whereas if we'd been in the office, I suspect we'd run out of energy by 5 o'clock, but no distance to commute. So I think let's try and keep it going. Let's find a way that we can share ideas. We definitely want to meet again within less than a year if possible. It would be so lovely if it could be in person, but you know, this does work well. And I think one of the experiences we've found is that having meetings remotely actually feels more inclusive, because you don't get people who sort of hold the screen the whole time and are always talking, and you can put your hand up or put something in the chat if you sort of actually don't want to speak, but you want to get your opinions over. So it is more inclusive, and I think we've got to bear that in mind going forwards too. So a big thank you to you all for coming. We will definitely keep in touch. We have your names and addresses now, and we will make sure that you know about the next time we organise this. And if you've got ideas, if you want us to organise something, just send a note in and we'll do it possibly even sooner than this. So thank you all very much and safe travels. Okay.
Sorry, can I just interrupt a little bit, because I do have some housekeeping to do, at the end. Thank you, Katie. Yes, thank you very much for joining us and participating. I'd like to thank our speakers, both Kevin and Anna. Thank you very much for thought-provoking talks. I'd also like to thank our workshop chairs and also very much the infrastructure that goes behind organising such an event as this. So you've got the Medical Schools Council, you've got Work Psychology Group, and you've got ASME staff working in the background to make sure everything goes as smooth, such as relocating the chair that has disappeared from one of the groups and can't get back in. So thank you for that. I think that I would agree entirely with everything that Katie has said. We will remain behind the chairs if anybody does wish to chat to us informally. It's not compulsory at all. And the final comment I would say is never waste a good crisis, and therefore do make the chance and the opportunities that this has provided to do some research. Because what I took away from Kevin's talk was that research gives us an opportunity to influence culture and practice, and therefore an opportunity to discuss. And so rather than just the research findings themselves, it's an opportunity to really make a difference. So thank you very much.